And welcome to this penultimate installment of the Humane Philosophy Ian Ramsey Centre seminar series for Trinity Term 2018. I'm very happy to see you all here, and I'd like to introduce our speaker, Daniel Kame, who's currently Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at the University of Lincoln, and previously was a college lecturer at St. Hugh's College, Oxford, and the Junior Research Fellow at Worcester College, also at Oxford University. And his research is mainly in post-Kantian philosophy and the philosophy of religion, and he is, of course, the leading expert in the English-speaking world on Nietzsche's philosophy, which is the reason we have invited him today to speak on Nietzsche as a Christian thinker. So please join me in giving a round of applause to our eminent speaker tonight.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's always a great pleasure to have an opportunity to come back to Oxford and to be back at Blackfriars in particular, where I haven't been for some years, but I have fond memories of teaching a course on the problem of evil here around 10 years ago. And it's the problem of evil that's going to feature quite centrally in my talk today. My aims in this talk are threefold. Firstly, to develop and defend a reading of Nietzsche's philosophy that I've presented in somewhat briefer form elsewhere, that ascribes to him a pervasive concern with the problem of evil, with the problem of theodicy. Secondly, to argue that it follows from Nietzsche's interest in the problem of theodicy that he is complicit with the putatively life-denying presuppositions of Christianity, which he attacks and from which he seeks fully to detach himself. My third aim is to assess Nietzsche's later attempts to move away from the project of theodicy in the direction of a notion of life-affirmation that is free from the negative valuation of life that I'm going to suggest is inherent in his earlier approach. So according to the interpretation of Nietzsche's later view that I'm going to advance here, Nietzsche comes to adopt a kind of deflationary position in respect of the whole question of theodicy. And this approach, I'm going to suggest, converges on the claim that any kind of theoretical or reflective concern with the problem of the value of existence, whether existence is a worthy object of affirmation, comes to be seen by Nietzsche as symptomatic of a kind of pathology. A remedy for which consists not in reaching a positive evaluative judgment about life, but rather a dissolution of the problem of theodicy itself. But I'll conclude that even in Nietzsche's most strenuous efforts to emancipate himself from the project of theodicy, he nevertheless retains a sense of the world and human existence as standing in need of redemption, and so is never fully outside the Christian tradition. When we look around the world, we find that it contains many undesirable states of affairs: death, suffering, loss, and so on, such that overall it can seem to us to fail to conform to our expectations about what ought to be the case, about how the world ought to be. While some of these undesirable states of affairs might reasonably be said to be necessary concomitants of other desirable states of affairs, or to be distributed according to some notion of desert, this can't plausibly be maintained in respect of all such states of affairs. For much, perhaps most, of what is undesirable in the world is, in William Rowe's terminology, gratuitous, in the sense that it can't reasonably be construed as necessary for the occurrence of some better state of affairs or for the avoidance of some worse state of affairs. It's also often seemingly meted out on an unmerited basis, in that much suffering can't be said to be proportional to or a consequence of some normative transgression perpetrated by the agent who suffers. Now, the existence of such undesirable states of affairs notoriously confronts Christian theism with a particularly acute problem. Evil constitutes evidence against the existence of God, evidence that seems to many to decisively outweigh the available evidence for the existence of God. So the task of traditional theodicy, as is well known, is to reconcile the existence of evil with the benevolence, omnipotence and omniscience of God. Now, typically two assumptions underpin this project of theodicy. Firstly, that suffering is not only of negative value, but poses a special problem for the overall value of life. So in Kant's terms, the task of theodicy is to vindicate the goodness of the world in, quote, the eyes of a holy judge. The second assumption that typically underpins this project of theodicy is that any putative solution to the problem will take the form of the identification of some principle, reason, or overarching purpose or higher good in terms of which suffering can be seen to be justified. Now, the normative project of a significant part of Nietzsche's corpus exemplifies with particular clarity the conceptual structure of this distinctively Christian pattern of thought. For throughout his writings, Nietzsche is centrally concerned with providing what he calls a revaluation of suffering that would facilitate what in his early work he calls a justification of existence, and later on an affirmation of life, even in its strangest and sternest problems. Now, Nietzsche is, of course, working with a post-Christian conception of the problem, and so he's not concerned to vindicate the goodness of the God of classical theism. Rather, it's his concern to demonstrate the goodness, in some suitably Nietzschean sense of the term, of life and the world in the face of what appears to us to be undesirable, what he calls the harsh, problematic, malevolent aspects of existence. At various points in his career, Nietzsche himself explicitly characterizes central elements of his project in terms of theodicy. He writes in his first published work, The Birth of Tragedy, for example, of art as providing, quote, the only satisfactory theodicy. And in section 1019 of The Will to Power, which is the first quote on your handout, he says that the pessimism of strength, which he repeatedly valorizes as a tragic or Dionysian form of pessimism, actually ends in a theodicy, i.e. in an absolute affirmation of the world. In addition to these explicit uses of the term theodicy, there are copious uses of the closely related quasi-theological notion of a justification of existence. The phrase appears twice in The Birth of Tragedy, once in Human All Too Human, once in Ecce Homo, and in numerous notebook entries throughout the 1870s and 1880s. In addition, there are many passages in which some version of theodicy is the focus, even though the term is not explicitly used. In traditional theodicy, it's God's inaction with respect to evil that requires justification. So the task is to provide an account of why God created a world in which all the suffering occurs, or of why God allows such suffering to occur. Now, according to Christopher Janaway, it's hard to find passages in which Nietzsche talks literally of justifying suffering. But there are many passages in which this seems to be his implicit concern. So in one of his late notebook entries, for instance, he describes existence as being, quote, blissful enough to justify even monstrous suffering. He also makes remarks that echo the Leibnizian claim that everything is ultimately for the best. Quote, everything actually happens as it should happen, every kind of imperfection. And the suffering that result are also part of the highest desirability. He makes a similar point elsewhere when he writes, My formula for greatness in a human being is love of fate, that one wants nothing other than it is, not in the future, not in the past, not in eternity. There's also the fact that throughout his writings, especially those of the 1880s, Nietzsche is deeply concerned with making us abandon our negative evaluation of suffering, and in particular the belief that suffering constitutes an objection to life. And his attempts to revalue suffering are sometimes offered in a spirit which again emulates Leibnizian theodicy. Leibniz's account of the actual world as the best of all possible worlds is intended, amongst other things, to show us that what appears to us to be undesirable is actually for the best. We think pre-theoretically that the world is not good or not as good as it could be, but once we've properly understood the situation, we see that the world is in fact as good as it could be, since no improvement is possible under the principle of sufficient reason. Now, Nietzsche comes to adopt a similar stance in respect of the putative badness of suffering. Under the influence of what he sees as traditional Christianity's hedonistic axiology, we automatically assign negative value to suffering, and then because of the pervasive extent of suffering, come to regard suffering as an objection to life itself. But this, Nietzsche insists, is a contingent fact about our evaluative practices. Hence, a solution to the problem of theodicy could, in principle, be provided by a reconfiguration of these acculturated evaluative attitudes. Brian Leiter rejects this framing of Nietzsche's project in terms of theodicy as, quote, a misleading comparison. This is quotation 4 on your handout. Obviously, it is of no interest to Nietzsche, Leiter writes, how to justify the existence of evil given God's omniscience, omnipotence, and benevolence. The question is not metaphysical, but psychological. This objection misses the point, since the claim is not that Nietzsche is engaged in theodicy as practiced in the Judeo-Christian monotheistic tradition, a claim that would indeed be manifestly absurd. The claim is rather that he takes over and develops a non-traditional secularized version of the problem. The task Nietzsche sets himself is not to vindicate the goodness of God in the face of suffering as per a traditional theistic theodicy, but rather to vindicate the goodness or desirability of life in the face of suffering. Now, to attribute to Nietzsche a theodicy in this sense is obviously to employ the term in an extended sense, but one that is nevertheless fairly common in general philosophical discourse. As Susan Nyman notes, in the history of philosophy, theodicy has a narrow sense which covers any theistic response to questions about how theism can be true in view of the existence of evil. But it also has a broad sense which refers to the systematic attempt to show that life is an appropriate object of affirmation, despite the sheer systematic, pervasive extent of suffering in the world. My claim is that Nietzsche's project belongs to the tradition of theodicy understood in this broad, proto-existential sense. The distinction between a broad and a narrow sense of theodicy raises questions in respect of the relation between the two enterprises. In particular, does the secular version contain residual aspects of the original theistic enterprise? This relates to Leiter's objection that the project of justifying suffering for Nietzsche is psychological rather than metaphysical, as per traditional Christian theodicy, and hence does not reinscribe the original Christian version. Leiter is right that Nietzsche's approach to the problem is psychological, but extrapolating from Nietzsche's view that the Christian theological perspective in general is the expression of a particular psychology, his view would be that the original Christian project, though articulated in metaphysical terms, is more fundamentally an expression of a certain type of psychology. So what defines the Christian project in Nietzsche's eyes is not its metaphysical formulation, but the particular psychology that gives rise to the demand for a theodicy in the first place. If that is right, it would allow for the possibility that the Christian project and Nietzsche's pursuit of a justification of existence are in fact distinct inflections of the same underlying impulse. And if that's right, it would have significant implications for Nietzsche's project, which is largely defined in terms of his desire fully to transcend Christian modes of thought and feeling. In any case, it's one of the central contentions of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity that natural psychological phenomena lie at the root of all metaphysical or theological theorizing. Hence, it doesn't follow from the fact that Christian theodicy is formulated in metaphysical terms, whilst Nietzsche's pursuit of a justification is psychological, that the two projects are not distinct inflections of the same underlying impulse. And in any event, Nietzsche's view would be that Christian theologians' reflexive understanding of theodicy is extraneous to the question of its actual nature. The Christian theologian's conscious representation of the purpose or function of theodicy has no more authority in Nietzsche's eyes as to its true purpose or function than has, say, the Christian moralist's understanding of his ascetic moral commitments. The equating of Nietzsche's project with traditional theodicy is therefore to be seen as an application of Nietzsche's more general view that conscious beliefs are epiphenomenal reflections of an agent's drives and affects. And it's by virtue of this general claim that Nietzsche is able, as he so often does, to distinguish between the meaning that some belief system or set of practices appears to have, the self-understanding that it presents to its defenders and opponents alike, and its true or underlying significance. In light of his tendency to deploy this distinction between the self-understanding of a belief system or set of practices and its actual underlying significance, the pertinent question in attempting to demonstrate from a Nietzschean perspective whether or not two ostensibly distinct intellectual projects or belief systems are different tokens of the same type is to ask, well, what is the underlying impulse to which these projects give expression? So to answer this question in respect of theodicy, let's consider the nature of the project of theodicy a little more closely. In its overtly theological guise, theodicy is the attempt to provide a solution to the problem of evil, that is, the problem of reconciling the existence of evil with God's omnipotent, perfect goodness. Well, the first thing to say here is that the problem of evil is really a misnomer. It's more than a problem. The problem of evil is more than a problem. It's an argument for atheism. So theodicy is, in effect, the attempt to provide a defeater for this argument and protect ourselves from the putative nihilistic implications of atheism. But to what end? That is, what is the particular value, the psychological raison d'etre of religious belief, which attempts to provide a theodicy seek to protect? One way to answer that question would be to consider the antecedent psychological structures from which religious faith emerges. Nietzsche's own views on the multifarious psychological origins of religious belief is complex, and the genealogical history of any specific set of religious claims will vary in accordance with the relevant set of contingent cultural and historical circumstances. Nevertheless, it's fair to say that Nietzsche's account of the psychological genesis of religious belief has affinities with Freud's psychoanalytic theory of religious belief. According to Freud, the principal task of civilization in general is to defend us against nature. To a significant extent, civilization does this fairly well, particularly in respect of protecting us from our own natural violent inclinations towards each other. But there are in addition, quote, this is quotation 5, there are in addition the elements which seem to mock at human control. The earth, which quakes and is torn apart and buries all human life and its works. Water, which deluges and drowns everything in a turmoil. Storms, which blow everything before them. There are diseases which we have only recently recognised as attacks by other organisms. And finally, there is the painful riddle of death, against which no medicine has been found, nor probably will be. For Freud, the shortcomings of the various existential strategies furnished by civilization, morality, science, medicine, and so forth, mean that we are encumbered with an urgent need for additional protection against the various dangers in our environment. This need is absolute, in Freud's view, in the sense that it must be satisfied in order for human beings to remain psychologically functional. But since it can't be met by the contrivances of civilization alone, i.e. purely naturalistically, it is ultimately discharged by recourse to supernatural conjectures, specifically, in Freud's account, by positing the existence of an invisible cosmic counterpart of the loving, protective father figure. Now, Freud is quite explicit that the primitive basis of religious belief is the need to fulfill, quote, the task of reconciling us to the sufferings of life. Like Freud, Nietzsche partly locates the origins of religious belief in the need to achieve reconciliation with suffering and to find the world a worthy object of affirmation. Christian belief, Nietzsche says, is, quote, belief in a God who in his love arranges everything in a manner that in the end will be best for us. A God who gives to us our happiness so that as a whole all is meet and fit and there is no reason for us to take life sadly, let alone exclaim against it. The belief that in the whole universe, too, benevolence and decency of disposition prevail. What this amounts to is the claim that a very specific prudential motive, roughly the need to believe that a judgment of the form life is good, is true, lies behind Christian theism. And if that is right, then the underlying motive behind any attempt to defend Christian theism against a putative defeater will be the need to preserve the basic optimism about life and the world that Christian theism makes possible. But if, as per the Freudian Nietzschean account of its psychological genesis, Christian theism is rooted in a primordial anxiety, then the project of Christian theodicy is essentially concerned not simply with vindicating the truth of the Christian worldview as such, but rather with sustaining Christianity's way of alleviating this anxiety. This means that theodicy is therefore really a psychological problem, not a metaphysical or theological one, and hence that on Nietzsche's own terms, it's possible for there to be a naturalistic, secular version of theodicy that reinscribes the pattern of thought expressed by its theological counterpart. Their respective modes of cognitive expression are different, but the non-naturalistic features of traditional theodicy are fully reducible to a naturalistic psychology that it shares with Nietzschean theodicy. The basic Nietzschean point then is this: Christian religious belief and its associated concerns are an expression of various cultural and psychological forces. If those forces remain and the Christian expression of them collapses, as Nietzsche believes he is witnessing in late 19th century European culture, then other expressions will take its place. Thus, for example, Nietzsche thinks that liberalism, socialism, and utilitarianism are all secularized expressions of those same forces. As Bernard Williams puts it, if need secretes thought and the need remains, then it will secrete new thoughts. Okay. So I've argued so far that Nietzsche is centrally and pervasively concerned with a secular variant of the Christian project of theodicy. My objective in this section will be to examine the implications of this for Nietzsche's critical project, which can, I think, be uncontroversially characterized largely in terms of his attempt to transcend Christianity and its secular embodiments, and therefore as inimical to a reiteration, whether conscious or unconscious, of any distinctively Christian structure of thought. In particular, I'm going to be concerned with the question of whether or not Nietzsche's apparent indebtedness to this element of the Christian theological perspective means that he is in fact complicit with the main target of his critical project, and that he is, malgré lui, a Christian thinker. It's important to clarify that what is at issue here is not whether Nietzsche is really concerned with saving Christianity rather than abolishing it, but rather whether he ends up unconsciously or unintentionally reinscribing this recurrent, deeply rooted Christian motif. As Raymond Geuss has aptly written, one of the acknowledged goals of philosophy is to understand other philosophers better than they understood themselves. My suggestion in what follows is essentially that we understand Nietzsche better than he understood himself by taking seriously the idea that despite his avowed hostility to Christianity, he remains deeply entangled in an interpretation of life and the world that he inherits directly from Christianity. On a traditional theological view, there are certain fundamental assumptions without which no worldview could be classified as authentically Christian. For example, that there exists a loving creator God who has a providential plan for the universe, that God became human in Jesus of Nazareth, and so on. Nietzsche is, of course, famously sceptical in respect of each of these fundamental assumptions of traditional Christianity. Furthermore, his condemnations of Christianity are arguably unrivaled in their ferocity and vitriol. Nevertheless, several commentators have claimed to discern beneath the skepticism and violent attacks on Christianity not only a religious sensibility, but patterns of thought that derive specifically from the Christian theological perspective. Indeed, in various places, Nietzsche himself seems to countenance the possibility of a secular recounting of the Christian theological view. The idea is already present, for instance, in one of the most well-known facets of Nietzsche's critique of Christianity, his claim that God is dead, and in particular in the way in which that claim is articulated in his parable of the madman in The Gay Science. Nietzsche's madman addresses his claim that God is dead to two audiences, to the theists in the church, but also to the atheists in the marketplace. One might think that it's not logically possible for such a claim, the claim that God is dead, to convey new information to an atheist. After all, that God does not exist is precisely what the atheist asserts. But Nietzsche's madman appears to think that it's the atheists rather than the theists who stand most in need of the news that God is dead. A plausible explanation for this, rather striking feature of the passage, is that Nietzsche understands Christian faith, not, or at least not essentially, in terms of a conceptually articulated belief in a supernatural entity, and hence that he countenances the possibility of a Christian atheism. This possibility is more explicitly acknowledged in his frequent accusation against Schopenhauer that despite his deep commitment to atheism, he was, as Nietzsche puts it in On the Genealogy of Morality, stuck in Christian modes of thought and feeling, and that it was on the basis of the Christian ascetic moral framework that Schopenhauer said no to life. Underlying these claims seems to be the suggestion that Christian dogmas are mere vehicles for a certain kind of normative outlook that can in principle be detached from any particular metaphysical or theological framework in which it might happen to be expressed. The possibility of a separation of Christianity from any conceptually articulated belief in dogma is also implied in Nietzsche's discussion of Raphael, this time in the form of praise rather than condemnation. Raphael, Nietzsche writes, said yes to life. He did yes. Consequently, he was no Christian. In other words, an affirmative stance towards life, saying yes to life, is antithetical to what Nietzsche understands the normative core of Christianity to be. Its hostility to the body, to the instincts, to animality, its implicit denigration of the earthly or empirical realm, in short, everything that causes suffering, in preference to the hereafter, which is conceived as a mode of existence in which suffering is wholly absent. So what is important in Christianity, on Nietzsche's understanding, is this normative core, the thesis, in short, that the world and human life stand in need of redemption. This is, at any rate, how Nietzsche understands Christianity. It may not be, his understanding of Christianity may not be authentic, but this is, at any rate, is his interpretation of Christianity, and it's one which he shares with his great teacher, Schopenhauer, for whom the great fundamental truth of Christianity, as Schopenhauer writes, is the need for salvation from an existence given up to suffering and death. As I discussed a moment ago, on Nietzsche's view, what is most important in understanding religious belief is not the specific theological doctrines that make up the religion in question, but rather the phenomena of individual or collective psychology. Now, on Nietzsche's account, the specific psychology that lies behind Christianity generates a very particular human task, namely the task of providing a theodicy. But it also represents or generates a specific attempt to discharge that task. Christianity, then, is concerned with catering to the need, born of a specific psychology, to regard human existence and the world as an appropriate object of affirmation. In this sense, Christianity, as Nietzsche understands it, is fundamentally concerned with the control of anxiety, the production of a sense of security, the satisfaction of the metaphysical need to regard the world as meaningful or good. The central point for present purposes is that the attempt to give a theodicy is what defines Christianity. And what underpins this whole project is an implicitly negative appraisal of the world and our situation in it. For it's only because our primordial encounter with the world is negative that an awareness of the need for a theodicy first arises. That's to say, to embark on the project of theodicy presupposes a prior experience of the world as at least apparently unsatisfactory or defective. Of course, the aim of theodicy is to demonstrate that the defects are merely apparent, or alternatively, that although real, the defects are outweighed by or are necessary for certain higher goods. That's to say, the aim of the enterprise of theodicy is to show that the world is good. But the starting point of such a project is necessarily a position from which the value of existence is very much in question. This is not to say that to engage in the project of theodicy is consciously to condemn life, but neither does the Christian, whom Nietzsche takes as a paradigm of life denial, consciously condemn life. Life is God's creation. To condemn life would be blasphemy. Given then that condemnation of life need not take the form of a consciously avowed cognitive belief, how could the mere pursuit of a justification or affirmation of life betray a life-denying attitude? Well, the first point to make is that the very raising of the question of the value of existence presupposes the possibility of a negative answer. So the orientation towards life expressed by the very raising of the question of the value of existence is itself life-denying. Again, Freud can be used here to help explain the idea. According to Freud, quote, "The moment a man questions the meaning and value of life, he is sick," implying that from the perspective of a healthy psychology, questions pertaining to the value of existence simply don't arise. To step back and assess the value of the totality of life is something which no healthy being does. It's only when things have already gone wrong that one raises questions such as, is life worth living? A stance towards life that is genuinely affirmative would not consider the world as standing in need of justification. So by engaging in the project of theodicy, as Nietzsche does, Nietzsche is perpetuating and reinforcing precisely that which, as an opponent of Christianity, he should be seeking to dismantle. Now, during Nietzsche's mature phase, he appears, at least intermittently, to be aware that in pursuing a theodicy, he is in fact reproducing rather than transcending a central element of the Christian theological view. In these moments in his corpus, he appears to be reaching for a mode of life affirmation that is free of the life-denying presuppositions of his early approach. I'd like to conclude by saying a few words about this later approach, to offer a brief sketch of some of the principal features of this mode of life affirmation, and to offer a provisional assessment of it in terms of the question of whether Nietzsche, in the end, succeeds in speaking from a position that can genuinely claim to overcome his Christian inheritance. Earlier on, I attributed to Nietzsche the view that the need for a theodicy is a fundamental or absolute human need. This claim now needs to be qualified, since Nietzsche's view is in fact not that all human beings stand in need of a theodicy. In particular, the human beings that don't require a theodicy are firstly those who already have a successful theodicy, and secondly those whose primordial encounter with the world is not of the kind attributed by Nietzsche and Freud to the general mass of humanity, that is, not an experience of the world as threatening, inhospitable, defective, or otherwise apparently set up so to thwart our desires. Any individuals who are not subject to that kind of primordial encounter with the world will have no need of a theodicy, because it's precisely that primordial encounter with the world as defective that's generative of the need for theodicy. Of course, those human beings belonging to the first category have a successful theodicy only because they previously did have a need for a theodicy, which they or the culture of which they're members were subsequently able to meet. In any case, it's human beings belonging to the second category that most interest Nietzsche, that is, individuals for whom the problem of theodicy never arises because they're not subject to the experience of reality as unsatisfactory. It's not that such human beings are not susceptible to suffering, but rather that suffering doesn't generate in them a sense of life or the world as defective, and so they don't experience a need for consolation for the various perceived deficiencies or imperfections in themselves or in the world. Such individuals suffer, but they don't problematize their or anyone else's suffering. They have no problem of suffering. Such individuals arguably represent Nietzsche's central normative ideal. As he puts it, the ideal of the most exuberant, world-affirming spirit. And it's to the nature of their life affirmation that I'll now turn. As I've said, the key feature of this form of life affirmation is that it's not the consequence of an implicitly life-denying process of reflection about the value of life. In the context of Nietzsche's discussion of the pre-Socratic Greeks and the masters or nobles of the first essay of On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche characterizes this form of life affirmation as immediate, instinctual, or spontaneous. It's also primarily a matter of one's affective orientation towards life and the world, rather than a judgment or consciously avowed cognitive belief. As he puts it in the genealogy, and this is quotation number 7, the well-born simply felt themselves happy. They did not first have to construct their happiness, to talk themselves into it. What this means is that this form of life affirmation, call it noble life affirmation, is quite different from the justification of suffering which Nietzsche sought in The Birth of Tragedy. A justification of suffering would, by definition, work by ascribing to suffering a value, purpose, or meaning in virtue of which suffering might be seen to be worthwhile. The only kind of affirmation that would not be consequent to a process of engaging in theodicy would be immediate and would therefore not construe suffering as constitutive of or as necessary for any putatively higher goods. Now, one might, of course, think that an unreflective affirmation of the kind that Nietzsche attributes to the nobles of the first essay of the genealogy, one might think that this kind of spontaneous, unreflective, affirmative stance towards life, one that hasn't been ratified by a justification, is in fact weaker than its more reflective counterpart, which by virtue of being theoretically grounded in conceptual thought is more secure. But this is clearly not Nietzsche's view, and I think for good reason. For Nietzsche's quite plausible view seems to be that the very attempt to provide a theoretical justification of existence is motivated by a need for reassurance and to assuage uncertainty, and hence is a sign that things have already gone wrong. Noble affirmation, by contrast, doesn't affirm life as a result of first reassuring oneself that suffering has this or that meaning, or that it's a necessary precondition of something else to which outweighing value is ascribed. And it's certainly not achieved as a result of calculating that, say, the aggregate of pleasure in the world is greater than that of pain. However, as Ken Jeames has pointed out, the problem for us moderns is that this kind of naive affirmation that Nietzsche attributes to the ancient Greeks and nobles of the first essay of the genealogy is no longer possible. This is partly because, as Nietzsche understands us, we have for 2 millennia been subjected to the redemption narrative of Christianity, to the idea that the world stands in need of redemption. This is such a deep-rooted idea that naive affirmation, the spontaneous or immediate affirmation of the nobles, isn't available to us. The upshot of this is that if Nietzsche is really to succeed in overcoming his Christian inheritance and attain a stance of genuine life affirmation, he would have to dissolve the problem of theodicy altogether. It's presumably with the model of the ideal life-affirming agent in the background that Nietzsche in his later works attempts to move away from providing a theodicy, to criticising the very need for a theodicy. For he comes to see a potential solution to the problem of theodicy as lying in a dissolution of the problem, rather than in the furnishing of a justification of existence. More specifically, he seeks to undermine the conceptual foundations of the whole project of theodicy. If the demand for a theodicy doesn't make sense, then, as Nietzsche will argue, this itself constitutes, in a sense to be determined, a kind of theodicy. Now, in various passages in his later works, Nietzsche articulates a scepticism with regard to the coherence of the whole project of theodicy, with a view to dismantling the project of theodicy. In a famous passage in Twilight of the Idols, for example, he writes, this is quotation number 8, judgments, value judgments concerning life, for or against, can ultimately never be true. They have value only as symptoms. The value of life cannot be assessed. Now, there's some ambiguity in this passage as to whether Nietzsche is making an epistemological claim that the value of life can't be known, or the metaphysical claim that life is the sort of thing, that life isn't the sort of thing to which values apply. The claim that the value of life cannot be assessed or estimated implies only that value judgments about life, whether positive or negative, can't be known, not that they can ultimately never be true. That neither positive nor negative value judgments about life can ever be true, on the other hand, implies something stronger than this epistemic point. Specifically, implies the metaphysical point that life lacks value altogether. The claim that both positive and negative value judgments about life can never be true is logically equivalent to the claim that all value judgments about life are false. So judgments of the form life is good are false, and so are judgments of the form life is bad. Life, in other words, is valueless. This is not to say that life has some very low value, but rather that it is, as we might say, beyond good and evil. Nietzsche thus appears to be suggesting in this passage that value judgments concerning life involve ascribing a property, value, to something, life, that could not possibly have that value, that could not possibly have that property. So this metaphysical claim is essentially the idea that to ascribe value, whether positive or negative, to existence is to commit a kind of category mistake. That is, to commit the ontological error of ascribing a property to a thing that could not possibly have that property. Now, it's very difficult to reconcile the epistemic claim that the value of existence can't be known with this metaphysical claim, because it makes very little sense to say on the one hand that values don't apply to existence and on the other hand that the value of existence can't be known. You wouldn't say that the weight of yellowness can't be known. One would say that to try to determine the weight of yellowness is to show a deep misunderstanding of the kind of thing that yellowness is. So Nietzsche seems to oscillate incoherently between the epistemic claim that the value of existence can't be known and the metaphysical claim that existence is not the sort of thing to which value can be ascribed. What is clear, though, is that Nietzsche came to regard the nihilism implied by the metaphysical point that values in general don't apply to existence as potentially and quite paradoxically providing the foundation for a certain kind of optimism or affirmation. It's usually thought that nihilism, if true, provides grounds for despair and even suicide. Nietzsche himself, of course, is often interpreted as being unqualifiedly opposed to nihilism. In respect of what he calls practical nihilism, that is, the threat that belief in the absence of objective value or purpose in the world would sap our energy and drives, this is undoubtedly correct, that Nietzsche was an opponent of nihilism. But as I now want to suggest, this overlooks another form of nihilism, which Nietzsche does not seek to overcome, but rather endorses as, quote, a divine way of thinking, and as a means to undercutting the pessimistic verdict on life. If value judgments can never be true, life is neither good nor bad. Hence, it makes no sense to respond to the world with approval or disapproval. For the truth of nihilism implies that the world contains no value. Nihilism isn't simply the thesis that the world has no value, it's the thesis that the world contains no such thing as value. It follows that we can't coherently say that it's a bad thing that nihilism is true. If nihilism is true, we can't even coherently say that a universe in which nihilism is true is worse than a universe in which it's false. As Thomas Nagel once put it, and this is quotation number 9, if sub specie aeternitatis, that there is no reason to believe that anything matters, then that doesn't matter either. Put differently, it can't be bad that there is absolutely nothing that is either good or bad. If nihilism is true, then its truth couldn't make the world worse or better, for the simple reason that nihilism entails that you can't say that a particular state of affairs is worse or better. So if nihilism is true, this fact cannot consistently be viewed as a bad thing, or even as worse than other possible worlds in which nihilism is false. Now, Nietzsche was well aware of the inconsistency that the nihilist is liable to fall into, alluded to in Nagel's remark. According to nihilism, this is quotation number 10, according to nihilism, Nietzsche writes, our existence has no meaning. The pathos of in vain is the nihilists. At the same time as pathos, an inconsistency on the part of the nihilists. If I believe that nihilism is true, it would be incoherent for me to lament this putative fact. At times, however, Nietzsche maintains not only that if we believe nihilism to be true, we can't coherently find this lamentable, but the further claim that it may be the grounds for some kind of optimism or affirmation. As Bernard Williams puts it, and this is quotation number 11, as Bernard Williams puts it, if no ultimately good or bad news can be found in history, it follows in particular that no ultimately bad news can be found in it, and this of course carries its own kind of good news. In a notebook entry from the late 1880s, Nietzsche makes what I think is essentially a very similar point, but he goes even further than Williams. Nietzsche says, becoming must appear justified at every moment, or incapable of being evaluated, which amounts to the same thing. Now, both Williams and Nietzsche's claims here are open to an epistemological and a metaphysical interpretation. Is the reason neither good nor bad news can be found because of our cognitive limitations, or because no such news exists? Is becoming incapable of being evaluated because we lack knowledge of the relevant facts, or because it's not the sort of thing to which values apply? On either reading, it's difficult to see how this would license any kind of optimism. On the epistemological reading, the claim is that we're ignorant of the value of becoming or history, which would at best warrant agnosticism about the value of becoming or history, not optimism. Perhaps ignorance would make room for hope or some kind of faith that things are for the best, but it would equally make room for pessimism. And on the metaphysical reading, the claim seems to amount to the incoherent thesis that the truth of nihilism makes things better. But as we've seen, rather than make things worse or better, the truth of nihilism should make no normative difference whatsoever. Note, however, that Nietzsche, in quotation 12, only claims that becoming will appear to be justified if it's incapable of being evaluated, not that it will actually be justified. Appear, the term appear here, I think indicates that we are here in the realm of first-personal phenomenology. And the Nietzsche is speaking not of what is logically entailed by the fact that becoming is incapable of being evaluated, but of how the belief that this is the case might affect us psychologically. There is no explicit indication in Williams' claim that he too is speaking phenomenologically, but perhaps to assume otherwise would be to misconstrue the argument. Could one say, for example, that the fact that the world or history is neither objectively good nor bad entails that the world or history isn't objectively bad, and the belief that this is true, i.e. that the world isn't objectively bad, causally affects, or could causally affect, our normative psychology in a positive way? Of course, that the world or history is neither objectively good nor bad also entails that the world isn't good, and so logically entails neither good nor bad news. But the claim is not what we should believe if we come to believe that the world is neither objectively good nor bad. The claim is about what effect such a belief would have on our subjective evaluative attitudes towards the world. And I suppose something like this might work in particular for someone like Schopenhauer or Nietzsche, who is obsessed with the question of the value of existence and tormented by the thought that the world might be radically evil. For such a person, the realization that in fact the world is just not the sort of thing to which value can be ascribed, and hence that it is strictly beyond reproach, might well be experienced as good news. Nietzsche famously makes similar claims about negative attitudes towards ourselves and others. Since in his view we are never ultimately morally responsible for who we are or what we do, reactive attitudes such as blame and resentment towards ourselves and others are always misplaced, and we are all always profoundly innocent. He seems to think this is a beautiful thought. One could view these ideas as the positive analogue of the more common psychological reaction to the belief that nihilism is true, namely depression. If a subject believes that nihilism is true, then he or she is being inconsistent if he or she also believes this to be a bad thing. He or she is inconsistent in holding that, firstly, nothing is good or bad, and secondly, that it is bad that nothing is good or bad. Now, it's uncontroversial that inconsistent beliefs are possible. Inconsistent beliefs are possible, and they're usually explicable in terms of some kind of cognitive failure, say the failure to notice the incompatibility of one's beliefs, confusion or failure of memory and so on. But such explanations don't seem very plausible in the case of the depressed nihilist. Could someone fail to see that his belief that nothing is good or bad is incompatible with his belief that it's bad that nothing is good or bad? But notwithstanding this logical inconsistency, it remains psychologically possible for a subject to accept the validity of this logical point about the inconsistency of their beliefs, and at the same time, for the subject to have a certain kind of very negative psychological response to the thought that nihilism is true. So the issue we're dealing with here is not about what is logically possible, but about what, given the structure of our psychology, is likely to happen to us if we came to believe that nihilism is true. The more common psychological reaction to the thought that nihilism is true is depression. Nietzsche and Williams want to indicate the possibility of an alternative kind of psychological response. How am I doing for time?
We should move into questions pretty soon.
Yes, okay. Okay, well, just by way of very briefly summing up then, I'll make this one final comment, which is that in attempting to dismantle the metaphysical presuppositions of theodicy by arguing that the world just isn't the sort of thing to which values apply, Nietzsche is, I think, attempting to eliminate the very need for a theodicy. As he writes in Daybreak, we need to learn to think differently so that we may feel differently. So by dismantling the conceptual presuppositions of theodicy, he is in effect hoping that ultimately we will be liberated from the need for a theodicy. But even here, arguably his most strenuous effort to extricate himself from the Christian narrative of redemption, he retains a sense of some other form of human life which is humanly available and better than our existing form of life. And so he lays himself open to the charge that he is, though offering a fully naturalistic, this worldly path to redemption, nonetheless reinscribing the Christian commitment to the deficiency of the human condition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an extremely stimulating talk. We've got our usual time for questions, so we can dive into anything anyone might say, and I'll save my chair's privileges for a bit later on, because I see there are a few hands up already. If you could just wait for Ralph to come around the room and give you the microphone. It won't make you be any louder, but it will go on the record.
Okay. Thank you very much. Interesting to hear what you spoke about theodicy from a Freudian perspective. I'm studying Carl Gustav Jung. I wondered what your thoughts might be on a Jungian perspective on theodicy, whereby we, as far as I can see, or Jung, did actually question how we define omniscience in God, in as much as he saw God as really an undifferentiated entity, hidden or as part of, or as forming the collective unconscious, of which we can only get rare glimpses now and then, which can be somewhat dualistic. But certainly, I think Jung can bring a lot to this debate, simply in not having any conventional view on God's omniscience, as really placing God back into what we are, placing God back into man, giving us a very strongly anthropocentric view of the Christian faith, one which is not well differentiated as yet, still evolving in each and every one of us. I just wondered what your perspective on Jung might be.
I'm afraid my knowledge of Jung is extremely limited. So you'd have to fill me in a bit on what his understanding of omniscience actually is.
Sure, yes. Basically, we have to question it. There is no, according to Jung, there is no external omniscient God there who is in control or not in control, but really God is fundamentally within each and every one of us, and forms the part of us which we don't express, our collective unconscious, which is common to all of us, yet encompassed by each and every one of us. And as we, I suppose, evolve spiritually, for want of a better way of expressing it, that collective unconscious impinges upon our consciousness. Now, Jung would see that in terms of what he would call the God Archetype, which is a manifestation of God through theophany, through dreams, visions, or in any way of our creative instincts as being manifest within us, but nonetheless remains murky and somewhat dualistic. That would be Jung's view on God. He would state that everything was said about God in the book of Job. He wrote a very interesting book about the answer to Job, which covers these very, very serious questions that we do have problems with God the Father. It seems a bit incompatible with today's society, and we have to question how we really think of omniscience as such. But it's a very interesting perspective to compare with the theodicy of Freud, I think. That's all I think.
But he basically agrees with Freud about the need for a theodicy, does he?
I think so, yes.
Yeah.
I need to really look at Jung versus theodicy. Jung was a complete believer, of course. Freud, being atheistic, saw religion as a kind of illness. Jung saw it as a fundamental expression of what we really are, of an expression of our deepest needs, basically, as a natural occurrence, and therefore very real. He was very much a believer.
Yes. So like Freud, he thought that we have a kind of absolute need for reconciliation with suffering and the world.
Basically evolving into our unconscious, and we are, the collective unconscious, we are growing in consciousness towards a unique expression within each and every one of us of what God is. So he very much believed we were heading in some kind of theosis, the Orthodox would say, some kind of heading towards God, each and every one of us. And this was a very natural process, which he defined as individuation, as a psychological process, but this individuation is occurring in each and every one of us, basically. That's the view, whereas Freud saw it all as a bit of a illness, really.
Right. I mean, that sounds immensely interesting. I mean, it was something I'll have to follow up on, I think.
Hi, thank you. So it's about your conclusion. I want to ask a question about that. Are you saying that, in your interpretation, Nietzsche was moving from worse to better? But Nietzsche didn't consider himself to be doing this? Well,
in the sense that he was looking for a mode of life affirmation that was free of what he saw as the life-denying presuppositions of the original theistic enterprise. Yeah. So in his view, he was moving from worse to better. Yeah.
Because it seems like what he arrives at in your description would simply be the truth of reality rather than better or worse. Because if it's, do you see what I'm saying? If life doesn't have...
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so, I mean, nothing can be said to be objectively better or worse if nihilism is true.
Yeah.
But then there's the question of what the psychological effect of that thought or belief will be on our normative psychology. So you can say that logically, the truth of nihilism doesn't entail that things are better or worse, but psychologically, the truth of nihilism or the belief that nihilism is true could affect us positively or negatively.
But would that have been an accidental... So let's say it affected Nietzsche positively.
Yeah.
Could you still say that he was sort of within the paradigm of theodicy if this was a sort of accidental discovery? I mean, if you can't... If it's unconscious or something you can't control how you react to it.
Right. Yeah. So it's not something which is necessarily under one's volitional control. But if his motive for making these claims, if his underlying motive for making these claims about the psychological effect of nihilism is that this is a way in which we can be redeemed from the need for redemption. This is a way in which the whole project of theodicy can be dismantled and overcome.
So I guess it
then in a
depends
sense
on
he's still in the business of theodicy.
so if that's his self-interpretation of what's going on. If his self-interpretation is that he's being redeemed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm sympathetic to the project, and I can think of another parallel, the issue of the Superman.
Right.
Because I've often thought this is a transposition of a Christian idea, supernaturalized humanity.
Mm-hmm.
You can find that in medieval writings and the life of grace. So I think, so I'm sympathetic to the project.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question, because I've often wondered, I'm very aware of Nietzsche's power as a prophet, but he talked about the transvaluation of all values as what we're going to be heading towards. And I've noticed how often how the word trans is appearing in all kinds of high-profile ways in society today. Was that what you were talking about towards the end of your talk, the transvaluation of values? I never understood what you meant by that, and maybe you've got some insights that you could help me with. Thank you.
Well, firstly, the point about the Übermensch or Superman, I agree that there are. That if the project were to be expanded or developed, then I would certainly want to look at the question of whether, in the figure of the Übermensch, Nietzsche is in effect transposing certain divine attributes to human beings. I mean, the Übermensch doesn't feature that centrally in Nietzsche's text, actually, although, of course, he's one of the most famous figures in Nietzsche's writings. But where he does figure, he is explicitly presented as the redeemer of mankind. So there's certainly a lot of relevance there. As regards what Nietzsche has in mind by the transvaluation or revaluation of values, well, on my reading, or on the reading that I've tried to develop here, he's primarily concerned with the revaluation of suffering. Nietzsche understands traditional Christian axiology as essentially hedonistic. So, for example, most of the Christian virtues, as Nietzsche sees them, are directed towards the alleviation of suffering and the promotion of happiness or well-being. The Christian conception of the highest good for human beings is essentially a condition in which suffering is wholly absent, and so on. So in his view, there's this underlying hedonism in Christianity, and it's that underlying hedonism, coupled with the predominance of suffering in the world, that, in Nietzsche's view, leads inexorably to a pessimistic verdict about the value of life. If you think that questions of value are settled ultimately by questions pertaining to pain or pleasure, and you think suffering predominates in the world, then you're going to be led inevitably to a negative valuation of the world. So I think that's what's Nietzsche's primary interest in his revaluation of values, revaluing suffering, and teaching and enabling us to overcome the tendency, which again he attributes to Christianity, to overcome the tendency to automatically assign negative value to suffering.
Thanks very much. Today we talked about Nietzsche as a Christian thinker, and I'm thinking of Christian thought post-Nietzsche. Sometimes I wonder whether Christian thought begins with the fall, and you set that as the background so that the redemptive process could be highlighted. And so if you think of, you talk about self-denial, but what if life denial, life affirmation is at the heart of creation, and you pursue that thought through and in some sense downplay the fall and reinterpret the Christ event, then would Nietzsche be helpful for such a project?
So the project being what exactly?
The Christian project with Jesus, but doesn't have to necessarily center on the redemptive, the cross event. Mm-hmm. Because redemption seems to be at the heart of the reading of the Christian story here.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and then that has to presuppose life denial of some sort and negativity of life.
Does it have to presuppose life denial? Why?
I hope it doesn't have to.
Right.
Precisely my point. But
Yeah.
then if there is a life affirmation, then why Jesus would... I mean, that's the typical question that would come about.
Well, I mean, why is the Christian story of redemption life-denying in Nietzsche's view? It's essentially because, as he understands it, Christianity encourages us to repress our instincts. It teaches us to turn against our instinctual nature. And as part of life, given that our instinctual nature is part of life, it's part of natural human existence, it is inherently life-denying. There's that aspect of Christianity which leads Nietzsche to think of Christianity in general as life-denying. And then there's the fact that in his view it places an emphasis on the hereafter at the expense of the earthly. It locates value in a metaphysical realm. So it's for those reasons that Nietzsche thinks of the Christian story as inherently life-denying.
I think, if I may, the question that follows on from that is whether Christian theologians can make use of Nietzsche, given that that's...
So that we don't begin our story with life denial, with the fall. Why does the Christian story have to
Well,
begin with the fall?
I mean, this is something which Stephen Mulhall has talked about very interestingly in his book Philosophical Myths of the Fall. I mean, the fact that a thinker who is so vitriolic and hostile towards Christianity ends up reiterating, reproducing a distinctively Christian structure of thought might be thought to point to an underlying truth in the Christian story. It might be thought that to show or suggest that the Christian interpretation of human existence contains secular truth.
Before we move to the next question, I just want to say, because we've reached the end of our allotted time, if anyone needs to leave, you're very welcome to go now, and we won't cast any shame on you or anything. But I know there are a few more questions in the room that I think we can...
two exactly. There's one from Mia, and then one...
You miscounted slightly. There's actually 4 because I was jumping off my own question.
Well, I'll keep my question to myself then.
Mine's short. I just wanted to ask.
Oh, that.
So we reached the view that Christianity is to blame for the feeling that the world is in need of redemption in the first place, and the noble affirmation of life doesn't start from that point. Unfortunately, that's impossible for us because of the 2,000 years of Christianity, us Western moderns or something. So I want to know, is it impossible, despite the fact that it is mistaken to think that life needs redemption for Nietzsche, which seems slightly strange to me, just because if it is a mistake, why can't we get over it by just recognizing intellectually that it is a mistake? And connectedly, is there a sense that nihilism is getting a bit of an easy time here in the face of the apparent primordial evidence that life is in need of redemption? Okay, so there's this intuitive view, the world is full of suffering and evil, and that's extremely awful. That may be incompatible with the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God, but it's certainly incompatible with nihilism, right? It's a really big logical challenge to nihilism, the presence of loads of evil and suffering, at least if nihilism is the view that there's no value. So why do we take it as a really important datum? As a challenge
Where's the
to
logical
theism?
incompatibility between
If
suffering
there's no
and
value,
nihilism?
there's no evil.
Oh, well, yes, okay. There's evil and nihilism are incompatible, but
Yeah.
suffering and nihilism aren't
No,
incompatible.
yeah.
So the first question was, if it's a mistake, why isn't it more straightforward to overcome? The idea that life stands in need of redemption. Well, I suppose Nietzsche's view is that it's so deeply rooted it's so deeply rooted in our psyche that it's not as straightforward as that. It's not simply a matter of correcting a cognitive error. I mean, the idea that the world stands in need of redemption has a 2 millennia history behind it in Nietzsche's eyes, which can't simply be corrected overnight by the recognition that it's based on dubious metaphysical assumptions. The second part was...
Is the intuitive datum of the existence of evil being treated less seriously without justification as a challenge to nihilism than it is as a challenge to theism? So I said it was one short question, it was 2 long ones.
Well, yes, if nihilism is true, then there is no evil. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
why is that a problem for Nietzsche? Because Nietzsche would just to go along with that.
Well, I have a sense, at least. Maybe I'd want to know what you think about this personally, as someone sympathetic to at least some of Nietzsche's thought on all this. I have a feeling that when it comes to theism, it's kind of unfashionable, dusty view. Evil seems like a really obvious challenge. Like, come on, how can you possibly deny this appalling evil that's all going on? When it comes to nihilism, quite a trendy modern view, people tend to say, well, yeah, evil doesn't really exist. Sure, you know, is there a reason why that's fair? Or is it just not true that people do that? It might be a complete parody, of course.
Well, what you're saying, in effect, it's much easier to dismiss evil for nihilists. It's much easier to dismiss evil for nihilists than it is for theists. We take evil to be a greater challenge to theists than we do for nihilists.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the denial that evil is an objective feature of the world, I think, is compatible with having a very strongly negative affective reaction to the existence of what is typically thought of as evil. I mean, there are plenty of... I mean, that's probably the predominant view in contemporary metaethics, isn't it? That ethical judgments are fundamentally expressions of affect. They're not cognitive states, really.
Yeah, so it has an explanation for the intuitive datum, which is lacking.
That would be the explanation. Okay. Yeah.
That's interesting. Thank you. I better pass it on. So I think it was less than that.
Yeah, I just realised that I didn't really know what Nietzsche would have said about other parts of the world, other civilizations, or other religions, or other philosophies, or whether particularly perhaps in the East with Buddhism or Taoism.
Right.
Does he ever talk about that, or?
He has quite a lot to say about Buddhism, because he has a lot to say about Schopenhauer, whose philosophy he thinks of as a version of certain aspects of Buddhist thought. I mean, Schopenhauer, like Buddhism, thinks of suffering as the predominant characteristic of human existence, and it's alleviated through turning the will against itself, through the systematic suppression of one's desire.
And did he have a problem with that as well?
But he had a problem with that. I mean, Buddhism, like Christianity, he thinks of as a life-denying religion.
Okay.
Yes.
And there were none that he was more sympathetic to?
Ancient Greek polytheism, he had a very different kind of attitude towards. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, he at no point does he object to a religion on epistemic grounds. I mean, he's sceptical about the fundamental assumptions of Christianity, ancient Greek polytheism, and so on. But he doesn't object to religion on epistemic grounds. He objects to Christianity not because he thinks its central claims are false, but because he thinks its central claims are life-denying.
Psychologically dubious. Anyway.
Well, yeah, psychologically very, very harmful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, mine is as short as Ralph's. Okay, just 5 questions. First one would be, what is the difference in metaphysical terms between secular theodicy, which you were referring to, and theodicy as such?
Mm-hmm.
And another one is, if there is any difference, and another one is related to this, what you were discussing also with Ralph now, the problem of the existence of evil and more or less contemporary understanding that evil doesn't actually have a substance, but which is also a consequence of Augustine's understanding that it's more related to actions as such. Would you see that more compatible with Nietzsche, or rather the idea that there is a noble man, his criticism of nobility, morality, which is separated from human being as such, and how is that, on the other hand, compatible with his understanding of human beings as not being good or evil?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first part of the question was to do with the metaphysics of
Secular
the original theistic
Yeah.
enterprise versus the secular version. Well, the secular version, at least in Nietzsche's hands, doesn't think of evil as an objective feature of the world. The problem is not the problem of evil, but rather the problem of suffering. So evil is conceived in purely naturalistic terms as suffering. So the problem is reconciling what Nietzsche sees as a psychological need that human beings have to regard their lives as good and worthwhile, how to reconcile that need with the pervasiveness of suffering in human existence. So it's an entirely psychological project in Nietzsche's hands.
Do you think still?
Well, so the argument was that ultimately the original Christian enterprise can be understood in the same sorts of terms, that it's reducible to the same sort of natural psychological phenomena that motivate the Nietzschean project. Of course, the Christian enterprise is dressed up in metaphysical or theological terms, but as Nietzsche understands it, all of that is really not that relevant to to its underlying or actual function. Its underlying or actual function is psychological. So it all boils down to Nietzsche's sort of proto-Freudian understanding of the purpose or function of religious belief as enabling us to achieve reconciliation with the suffering of life. If that's right, then the metaphysical or theological framework in which Christian theism is presented is actually not essential to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second question was,
the idea that evil doesn't have substance or being, or it exists and it's just the matter of an action. So would you say that Nietzsche
Sorry,
is,
just a matter of an action?
part of the effect or of what is happening? So it's not a part of the contemporary understanding of evil, which is not a part of it doesn't have its own existence, so it doesn't have a substance, evil or good as such. It's just a property of an action. So would you say that Nietzsche's understanding is more related, his understanding of evil is more close to that idea, which also follows a Christian tradition in a way, or it more refers to understanding of human being as being good or bad. Because he does speak about he's criticizing nobility as such and speaking about noble men. And on the other hand, how is that compatible with his idea that human beings are not good or evil in general sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question for any Nietzsche commentator, I would say, because, I mean, Nietzsche certainly looks very much like he's an anti-realist. There's no objective value, good or bad, and yet he's very vocal in his condemnation of certain types of human being, his condemnation of certain types of character trait or quality of personality, so on. He's very vocal in his condemnation of certain kinds of culture, and conversely, he's very vocal in his admiration of certain kinds of individuals. So those are two aspects of Nietzsche's thought which is very difficult to reconcile. I mean, some people think he's just speaking from his own private idiosyncratic perspective. He's just articulating his own subjective evaluative preferences. But there's a very lively debate about that very question. Because it certainly looks when he's condemning the Christian, or when he's condemning Wagner, or when he's condemning Schopenhauer, it certainly looks like he's making evaluative claims that he regards as true. He's not just articulating his own subjective preference, but in those passages where he does talk about these sorts of metaethical issues, he's pretty clearly putting forward some form of anti-realism.
Okay, I think we had one final question.
Yes. So there are no objective values. So what would be the place of freedom and liberation, for example, liberation from fault, in this system, valueless, where this, in this system, in this understanding of valueless, neither good nor bad concept of existence, of human existence. Not problem of evil, problem of freedom.
What is the problem of freedom?
What is the place of freedom in this valueless concept of life, of human existence? Doesn't have any value either. Is not his project as a whole some kind of project of striving for freedom, striving for liberation from the fault, from the faulty understanding of others, including Christians. So this is a large question. Place of freedom in his body of work.
Are you suggesting that freedom
I'm
is...
not suggesting anything.
Right.
I'm not suggesting anything. No. I just would like to know if he wrote about.
He wrote quite extensively about freedom and responsibility. I mean, as a psychologist, in many ways Nietzsche was a much better psychologist than he was a philosopher. But he's very interested in the psychology of freedom and responsibility, in particular why it is that we're so strongly inclined to regard ourselves as free and to want to hold people responsible for their actions. I mean, his speculative claim was that a very significant part of the motivation behind our tendency to ascribe freedom and responsibility to people is a desire to hold them responsible in order to make them suitable objects of blame and punishment. And that was a purely speculative psychological claim that Nietzsche made, but it's one which I think has been largely ratified by recent empirical psychology, interestingly.
So freedom has a value.
Well, freedom Nietzsche thinks of as a fiction, as an invention. It's part of the Christian moral interpretation of existence. as Nietzsche understands it. We're not metaphysically free in the way that Christianity depicts us as being. And as I say, his speculative hypothesis as to why human beings invented the concept of free will and responsibility was in order to be able to punish and hold each other responsible.
Okay, I think we're going to have to draw to a close, although there will be a chance to continue talking over the next 15-20 minutes or so when we'd like to invite you to grab another glass of wine and some more refreshments. However, before we do that, I'd like to thank again everyone for coming and ask you to thank again our speaker, Daniel Kane.
Thank you.